What is going on YouTube? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to go over one of what I thought would be a really cool animal to cover. I think it's one of the coolest animals we used to have, because this one is unfortunately officially extinct. That may not be that way for long. There's a lot of opportunity for this one, I believe, to bring it back. But there's also a lot of controversy amongst bringing it back, which we can get into further in the video. But today we're talking about passenger pigeons. Now, passenger pigeons may not seem like a lot, but these birds used to flock in the millions. Like there are literally stories about them covering out the sky for a day on end and just traveling for miles without seeing the end of the flock. Which unfortunately is what caused their downfall. They were just too easy to pick off, and then once technology caught up with the birds, it was just too fast, and people were, I believe, attacking their nesting sites and just essentially not letting up on taking out the bird. There were full industries revolved around hunting and killing these birds in particular. So, people are people. This was a long time ago, so I mean, it's not like people really cared back then, not like we do now. And they didn't think it was going to end, I think, honestly. I mean, it's kind of like the same principle as the bison. There were just so many of them, there's no way you could ever run out. And then one day you do. Unfortunately enough, with the bison, we were smart enough to isolate, certain herds and stuff and actually manage to save them from extinction. But these birds just had no chance at all from the beginning. Like, it's one of those things that sucks. It's just like the thylacine. Like, the infrastructure was sort of there to where we could have saved them. There were captive flocks that people had. There was just no want nor need, or I guess maybe not need, but there was just no want to actually try and save these particular animals. So, yeah, but we're going to try and probably cover all of that. The first article we're going to go over for sure, though, is the last passenger pigeon, because it's actually a really sad story. And it really will make you kind of sad when you hear it, I think. But I think it's important that we know about these stories. And her name was Martha. She died alone in a zoo. Her two other mates died. And obviously, they weren't breeding well in captivity because they probably just didn't have all the right circumstances they needed. But yeah, so we're going to go ahead. We're going to get into this. And I hope you guys enjoy the video. If you guys do, please remember to hit that like button, the subscribe button, hit that notification bell. Follow me on all of my social medias, which will be at the end of the video, and drop any comments down below on anything you guys want me to cover in the future, or just what you guys thought about the article. So yeah, without further ado, this is the passenger pigeon and how they went extinct. So as I always like to do, guys, I should just like to say I don't own the rights to these articles. I simply use them to pass along information to you guys. This particular article is in naturalhistory.si.edu. If you guys would like, please go there and show them some love. If not, just stick around and we will go through this together. Martha, the last passenger pigeon. Martha, the passenger pigeon, passed away on September 1st, 1914 in the Cincinnati Zoo. She was believed to be the last living individual of her species after two male companions had died in the same zoo in 1910. Martha was a celebrity at the zoo, attracting long lines of visitors. When she was found dead on the floor of her cage that afternoon, she was immediately frozen into a 300-pound block of ice and shipped by fast train to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where her body was carefully preserved as a taxidermy mount and anatomical specimen. The passenger pigeon had been the most abundant species of bird in North America only decades earlier. Its extinction helped to inspire our modern conservation ethic. The specimen made from Martha's remains is one of the most treasured possessions of the Smithsonian Institute. It is on public display in the museum's Objects of Wonder exhibit. And I guess that's a picture of it, maybe. It's a really good picture. Yeah. So I mean that's just a quick little background on Martha. She was the last one. She did die in her cage. She was alone. Her two male companions died. I doubt there was any real attempt to breed them at that point, but yeah, I mean just imagine that. Like I don't know if any of you guys have ever managed to actually like experience it, but for that point in time, you could go to the Cincinnati Zoo, and this was the last one. There were no more, at least no official sightings in the wild. Maybe some held on in like little remote pockets, or once their flocks got down too small, we couldn't find them. But yeah, so that's just a little backstory on Martha, and I figured we'd go over that real quick. So the actual long one with all the history is going to be this next article. It is why the passenger pigeon went extinct. Like I said previously, guys, if you guys would like to go and show audubon.org some love, please go ahead. If not, just stick around. This one's really cool. This actually gets into like the big flocks and the actual talks about them like going down into canyons and things, and it's actually I think a lot of really good information. So why the passenger pigeon went extinct and whether it can and should be brought back to life by a century after it disappeared. Yes, we're going to get into all of that and the ethics of it here in a little bit, but I figure we'll at least let the article touch on it, and then I'll fill in whatever gaps that I know that the article doesn't touch. There's passenger pigeons that were, I guess, mounted. Some of those mounts are scary. Look at their eyes, like two different colors. Men still live who in their youth remember pigeons, trees still live who in their youth were shaken by a living wind, but after a few decades hence only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last only the hills will know. In May 1850, a 20-year-old Potawatomi tribal leader named Simon Pokagon, and I apologize for mispronouncing the names, was camping at the headwaters of Michigan Manistee River during trapping season when a far-off gurgling sound startled him. It seemed as if an army of horses laden with sleigh bells was advancing through the deep forest towards me, he later wrote. As I listened more intently, I concluded that instead of the tramping of horses, it was distant thunder, and yet more the morning was clear, calm, and beautiful. The mysterious sound came nearer and nearer until Pokagon deduced its source. While I gazed in wonder and astonishment, I beheld, moving towards me in an unbroken front, millions of pigeons, the first I had seen that season. And that actually brings me to a good point that I didn't even think of. Native Americans live with flocks. Like they knew about them. They timed their migrations perfectly, and they lived in harmony with them forever. It wasn't until Europeans started coming over here that the passenger pigeon was in trouble. Like if we could have just learned from the Native Americans and how they handled the flocks of pigeons, they would probably still be here today, and they would actually be a great source of food if handled properly. Um, but I mean, lessons to be learned from history. These were passenger pigeons, Ectopites migratorius, which is fun. They actually just have, they're known for migrating and they just have migration in their scientific names. At the time, the most abundant bird in North America and possibly the world. Throughout the 19th century, witnesses had described similar sightings of pigeon migrations, how they took hours to pass over a single spot, darkening the firmament and rendering normal conversation inaudible. Pokagon remembered how sometimes a traveling flock arriving at a deep valley would pour its living mass hundreds of feet into a downward plunge. I have stood by the grandest waterfall of America, he wrote, yet have my astonishment, wonder, and admiration been so stirred as when I have witnessed these birds drop from their course like meteors from the heavens. Pokagon recorded these memories in 1895, more than 4 decades after his Manistee River observation. By then, he was in the final years of his life. Passenger pigeons, too, were in their final years. In 1871, their great communal nesting sites had covered 850 square miles of Wisconsin's Sandy Oaks Barrens. 136 million breeding adults, naturalist A.W. Schroger later estimated. After that, the population plummeted until by the mid-1890s, wild flock sizes numbered in the dozens rather than the hundreds of millions or even billions. Then they disappeared altogether, except for 3 captive breeding flocks spread across the Midwest. About September 1st, 1914, the last known passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died at the Cincinnati Zoo. She was roughly 29 years old, with a palsy that made her tremble. Not once in her life had she laid a fertile egg. So the last one was just infertile, it sounds like. Maybe Martha just had those issues. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the passenger pigeon's extinction. In its intervening years, researchers have agreed that the bird was hunted out of existence, victimized by the fallacy that no amount of exploitation could endanger a creature so abundant. Between now and the end of the year, bird groups and museums will commemorate the centenary in a series of conferences, lectures, and exhibits. Most prominent among them is the Project Passenger Pigeon. Now, this article is probably a little older now. A wide-ranging effort by a group of scientists, artists, museum curators, and other bird lovers, while their focus is on public education, an unrelated organization called Revive and Restore is attempting something far more ambitious and controversial. using genetics to bring the bird back. Project Passenger Pigeons leaders hope that by sharing the pigeon story, they can impress upon adults and children alike our critical role in environmentalism conservation. It's surprising to me how many educated people I talk to who are completely unaware that the passenger pigeon even existed, says ecologist David Blockstein, senior scientist at the National Council for Science and the Environment. Using the centenary is a way to contemplate questions like how was it possible that this extinction happened, and what does it say about contemporary issues like climate change? They were evolutionary geniuses, traveling in vast gargantuan flocks throughout the eastern and midwestern United States and Canada. The males slate blue with copper undersides and hints of purple. The females, more muted, passenger pigeons would search out bumper crops of acorns and beech nuts. These they would devour using their sheer numbers to ward off enemies and strategy known as predator satiation. But basically means you have so many of you, predators can't pick one versus the other. It's the same idea as zebras. That's why zebras always travel in herds and they have their flocks. So it's like, or their stripes. So it's like a predator can't focus in on just one individual. It gets confused in the crowd. And that's why all birds flock like that. It's essentially a defense mechanism. They would also outcompete other nut lovers, not only wild animals, but also domestic pigs that had been set loose by farmers to forage. In forest and city alike, an arriving flock was a spectacle, a feathered tempest. In the words of conservationist Aldo Leopold, one 1855 account from Columbus, Ohio, describes a growing cloud that blotted out the sun as it advanced towards the city. Children screamed and ran for home, it said. Women gathered their long skirts and hurried for the shelter of stores. Horses bolted, a few people mumbled frightened words about the approach of the millennium, and several dropped on their knees and prayed. When the flock had passed over 2 hours later, the town looked ghostly in the now bright sunlight that illuminated a world plated with pigeon ejecta. So basically, like, the Europeans weren't accustomed to this. So when a literal group of a billion bird or millions of birds flies over your city, blocks out the sun, everybody freaked out. And like they ran for the hills, they got inside, they prayed to God that the apocalypse wasn't coming. All of this from like literally the sound of a million birds' wings flapping. And just can you even imagine that? Like all of those birds flying over your head. You can't, like, they blocked out the sun, so now it got dark all of a sudden. All you hear is the whoosh of them flapping their wings, and all of a sudden, like, it's just like almost like the apocalypse, like almost like hell has just arrived on Earth. And then when they leave, you have a whole other kind of hell on Earth because now they've left their droppings all over your basically everything. Could you imagine a million birds pooping? I can't, but I can only imagine like just a white carpet over everything. Like if that were to happen today, honestly, like people's cars would go from black to white like that. And that's just insane to me. But just to think about, like it almost I really wish I could have seen it personally. Because I think it would just add like a whole new perspective to me for nature. Nesting birds took over whole forest, forming what John James Audubon in 1831 called solid masses as large as hogsheads. Observers reported trees crammed with dozens of nest apiece, collectively weighing so much that branches would snap off and trunks would topple. In 1871, some hunters, coming upon the morning exodus of adult males, were so overwhelmed by the sound and spectacle that some of them dropped their guns. Imagine 1,000 threshing machines running under full headway, accompanied by as many steamboats groaning off steam, with an equal quota of RR trains passing through covered bridges. Imagine these massed into a single flock, and you could possibly have a faint conception of the terrific roar the Commonwealth of newspaper of in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, reported of that encounter. So basically, they were loud. The birds weren't just noisy, they were tasty too, and their arrival guaranteed an abundance of free protein. You think about this, especially with the spring flocks, says Blockstein, the ecologist. The people on the frontiers have survived the winter. They have been eating whatever food they've been able to preserve from the year before. Then, all of a sudden, here's all this fresh meat flying by you. It must have been a time for great rejoice. The pigeons are here. Not everyone shouted with joy. The birds also devoured crops, frustrating farmers and prompting Baron de la Hontan, a French soldier who explored North America during the 17th century, to write that the bishop has been forced to excommunicate them oftener than once upon the account of the damage they do to the product of the earth. Basically, he had to cover what the birds destroyed with money. Basically, put out a hit on all the birds. The flocks were so thick that hunting was easy. Even waving a pole at them, the low-flying birds would kill some. Still, harvesting for substance didn't threaten the species' survival. But after the Civil War came two technological developments that set into motion the pigeon's extinction: the national expansion of the telegraph and the railroad. They enabled a commercial pigeon industry to bloom, or to blossom, fueled by professional sportsmen who could earn who could learn quickly about new nesting and follow the flocks around the continent. Hardly a train arrives that does not bring hunters or trappers, reported Wisconsin's Kilburn City Mirror in 1871. Hotels are full, coppers are busy making barrels, and men, women, and children are active in packing the birds or filling the barrels. They are shipped to all places on the railroad and to Milwaukee, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And that's what I was talking about. Like, basically, if we could have just kept like subsistence hunting them, it wouldn't have been so bad. They would have been able to recover. We could have controlled the populations once all that got put into effect. Honestly, though, a lot of that wouldn't have gotten put into effect had it not been for this particular animal. But it was manageable. Like, it wasn't until it became a commercialized thing that they started having trouble. And the invention of the telegraph, basically, hey, flock's going this way, hop on the telegraph. The big bird of pigeons is going to this city. It should be here, at this rate. So people could get ahead of it on the railroads, which were also new. So basically, these people would probably just travel from one side of the country to the other, just taking out these flocks of birds, giving them to the people who are going to process them and send them out to all these places. And it was just too much. The pigeons could not keep up. And that wasn't the only thing, and they're going to get into that next. And this is truly the sadder part of this story. But, we got to get through it. The professionals and amateurs together outflocked their quarry with brute force. They shot the pigeons and trapped them with nets, torched their roosts, and asphyxiated them with burning sulfur. They attacked the birds with rakes, pitchforks, and potatoes. They poisoned them with whiskey-soaked corn. Learning of some of these methods, Potawatomi leader Pigeon despaired. These outlaws to all moral sense would touch a lighted match to the bark of the tree at the base, when with a flash, more like an explosion, the blast would reach every limb of the tree. He wrote of an 1880 massacre, describing how the scorched adults would flee and the squabs would burst upon hitting the ground. Witnessing this, Pigeon wondered what type of divine punishment might be awaiting our white neighbors who have so wantonly butchered and driven from our forests these wild pigeons, the most beautiful flowers of the animal creation of North America. Yeah, this is whatever. There was no laws like back then. There's no humane way to kill them. There's no, like these is the level of birds you can get. It was just literally open season. Like they didn't care how you got rid of them as long as they got rid of them. They were killed, and as long as they could process them still, they would just go. So they burned down their nest, poison them, just whatever you could think of to to kill them essentially. Yeah, so it's really sad. And like by the squabs, that's what a baby pigeon is. So they'd light fire to the nesting trees, and then the adults would fly away on fire, so they'd just be easier to get, and they'd just die later. And then the babies would just fall to the ground and basically just burst, and that's really sad. So it really was like they had no shot of basically being able to repopulate, because once you start attacking their nesting sites, there's nothing they can do. If you can't have more babies, then you can't continue on your legacy or your line or anything. Like the species can't go on if they're taking out the nests, and that's what we were doing essentially. Ultimately, the pigeon's survival strategy, flying in huge predator-proof flocks, proved their undoing. If you're unfortunate enough to be a species that concentrates in time and space, you make yourself very, very vulnerable, says Stanley Temple, a professor emeritus of conservation at the University of Wisconsin. Passenger pigeons might have even survived the commercial slaughter if hunters weren't also disrupting their nesting grounds, killing some adults, driving away others, and harvesting the squabs. It was The double whammy, says Temple. It was the demographic nightmare of overkill and impaired reproduction. If you're killing a species far faster than they can reproduce, the end is a mathematical certainty. The last known hunting victim was Buttons, a female which was shot in Pikes County, Ohio in 1900 and mounted by the sheriff's wife, who used two buttons in lieu of glass eyes. Almost 7 decades later, a man named Clay Southwark took responsibility for shooting Buttons, not knowing her species when he was a boy. So yeah, he just literally shot and killed all of them all the way to the end. Even as the pigeons' numbers crashed, there was virtually no effort to save them, says Joel Greenberg, a research associate with Chicago's Peggy Note Barrett Nature Museum and the Field Museum. People just slaughtered them more intensely. They killed them until the very end. Contemporary environmentalism arrived too late to prevent the passenger pigeon's demise. But the two phenomena share a historical connection. The extinction was part of the motivation for the birth of the modern 20th century conservation, says Temple. In 1900, even before Martha's death in Cincinnati Zoo, Republican Congressman John F. Lacey of Iowa introduced the nation's first wildlife protection law, which banned the interstate shipping of unlawfully killed game. The wild pigeon, formerly in flocks of millions, has entirely disappeared from the face of the earth, Lacey said on the House floor. We have given an awful exhibition of slaughter and destruction, which may serve as a warning to all of mankind. Let us now give an example of wise conservation of what remains of gifts of nature. That year, Congress passed the Lacey Act, followed by the tougher Weeks-McLean Act in 1913, and 5 years later, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protects not just birds, but also their eggs, nests, and feathers. All of that came out of the passenger pigeons dying. Because it took us killing off millions of birds to realize that, oh, this is a bad thing that we did. And at least someone was smart enough to realize that. And this is actually, like I said, like a good basis for a lot of our conservation throughout the, into the future in modern times. The passenger pigeon's story continued to resonate throughout the century. In the 1960s, populations of dixickles, a sparrow-like neotropical migrant, began crashing, and some ornithologists predicted its extinction by 2000. It took decades to uncover the reason. During winters, the entire world population of the grassland birds converged into fewer than a dozen huge flocks, which settled into the llanos of Venezuela. There, rice farmers who considered the dixickles a pest illegally crop dusted their roots with pesticides. They were literally capable, in a matter of minutes, of wiping out double-digit percentages of the world's population. The accounts are very reminiscent of the passenger pigeon. As conservationists negotiated with rice growers during the 1900s using research that showed that dixickles was not an economic threat. They also invoked the passenger pigeon extinction to rally their colleagues in North America and Europe. The efforts paid off. The bird's population has stabilized, albeit at a lower level. And that could have happened with passenger pigeons. We wouldn't have millions of them, but we'd still have passenger pigeons. Today, the pigeon artist and scientist alike, sculptor Todd McGrain, creative director of the Lost Bird Project, has crafted enormous bronze memorials of 5 extinct birds. His passenger pigeon sits at the Grand Insurance Audubon Center in Columbus, Ohio. The Lost Bird Project has also designed the origami pigeon, like the one bound into this magazine, and says thousands have been folded as a symbolic recreation of historic flocks.
The most controversial effort inspired by the extinction is a plan to bring the passenger pigeon back to life. In 2012, long-known foundation President Stewart Brand, a futurist best known for creating the Whole Earth catalog, and genetics entrepreneur Ryan Thielman co-founded Revive and Restore, a project that plans to use the tools of molecular biology to resurrect extinct animals. The project's flagship species is the passenger pigeon, which Brand learned about from his mother when he was growing up in Illinois. Revive and Restore hopes to start with the band-tailed pigeon, a close relative, and change its genome into the closest thing to the genetic code of the passenger pigeon that we can make, says research consultant Ben Novak. The resulting creature will not have descended from the original species, but if I give it to a team of scientists who have no idea that it was bioengineered, and I say, classify this, if it looks and behaves like a passenger pigeon, the natural historians are going to say, this is Ectopus migratorious. And if the genome plops right next to all the other passenger pigeon genomes, and you sequence from history, that a geneticist will have to say, this is a passenger pigeon. It's not a bantel pigeon. That is kind of rough, though. Like, that opens up a whole new chapter in science if they succeed in doing this, because then you don't have, like, if something goes extinct and we can just bring it back, that's going to change the exact, like, everything we look at as far as how conservation works. Because, I mean, like, I don't know, it's just like, why protect things if we can just bring them back, you know? So it's scary to think of, but it's would be fixing a thing, but also like it's almost like reintroducing a dangerous species. Like farmers don't want to reintroduce wolves because they're going to eat their livestock. Bears, you can't just put bears into certain places because they will like kill things. You can't bring these things back to life because one of the problems that we've already had that contributed to their extinction the first time was they were decimating crop fields, and you can't like make them stop. If you recreate passenger pigeons and you recreate the flocks, that's gonna happen. And the ecosystem itself may not be able to support large flocks like that anymore. I'm sure they're doing all the research into that, and I don't know. But I'd be happy to see it, but they could also just end up living in zoos the rest of their life, which is sad. So I don't know. Maybe this one, if they can do it, it's one of those things whether you can or should do something, you know? So I guess we'll find out in the future whether or not they actually succeed. Revive and Restore plans to breed the birds in captivity before returning them to the wild in the 2030s. Novak says the initial research indicates that North America's forests could support a reintroduced population. He hopes the animals brought back from extinction, not just birds, but eventually also big creatures like woolly mammoths, will draw the public to zoos in droves, generating revenues that can be used to protect wildlife. De-extinction can get the public interested in conservation in a way that the last 40 years of doom and gloom has beaten out of them, he says. Hold on, guys. Other experts aren't so sanguine. They question whether the hybrid animals could really be called a passenger pigeon. They doubt the birds could survive without the enormous flocks of the 19th century, and they question Novak's belief that the forest could safely absorb the reintroduction. The ecosystem has moved on, says Temple. If you put the organism back in, it could be disruptive to a new dynamic equilibrium. It's not altogether clear that putting one of these extinct species from the distant past back into an ecosystem today would be much more than introducing an exotic species. It would have repercussions that we're probably not fully capable of predicting. That's pretty much what I was talking about. Like, if the ecosystem has moved on, if you reintroduce them, they're gonna wreck the ecosystem. And, like, things aren't accustomed to eating them anymore, so you might still actually have to hunt them to control their populations. It's nuts. Blockstein says he wanted to use the 100th anniversary as a teachable moment, which eventually led him to Greenberg in Chicago, researcher who had been thinking independently about 2014's potential. The two men reached out to others until more than 150 institutes were on board for a year-long commemoration. Museums, universities, conservation groups, including the Audubon state offices and local chapters, libraries, artist organizations, government agencies, and nature and history centers. Project Passenger Pigeon has since evolved to be a multimedia circus of sorts. Greenberg has published Feathered River Across the Sky, a book-length account of pigeons' glory days. Filmmaker David Ramirez plans to release a documentary called From Billions to None. At least 4 conferences will address the pigeon's extinction, as well as several exhibits. We are trying to take advantage of every possible mechanism to put the story in front of audiences that may not necessarily be birdwatchers, may not necessarily even be conservationists, says Temple. The commemoration goes beyond honoring one species. Telling the pigeon story can serve as a jumping off point for exploring the many ways human influence and often jeopardize their own environment. Today, an estimated 13% of birds are threatened, according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So are 25% of mammals and 41% of amphibians, in large part because of human activity. Hydropower and road construction imperil China's giant pandas. The northern bald ibis, once abundant in the Middle East, has been driven almost extinct by hunting, habitat loss, and difficulties of doing conservation work in war-torn Syria. Hunting and destruction of wetlands for agriculture drove the population of North America's tallest bird, the whooping crane, into the teens before stringent protection along the bird's migratory route and wintering grounds helped the wild flocks build back to a few hundred. Little brown bats are dying off in the United States and Canada from a fungus that might have been imported from Europe by travelers. Of some 300 species of freshwater mussel in North America, fully 70% are extinct, imperiled, or vulnerable. Thanks to the impacts of water pollution from logging, dams, farm runoff, and shoreline development. Rising sea temperatures have disrupted the symbiotic relationship between corals and plant-like zooxanthellae. Yeah, sorry. Leading to a deadly phenomenon called coral bleaching. One-third of the world's reef-building coral species are now threatened. If public disinterest helped exterminate the passenger pigeon, then one modern-day parallel might be public skepticism about climate change. In an October poll by the Pew Research Center of the People of the Press, only 44% of Americans agreed there was solid evidence that the Earth is warming because human activity, and scientists now overwhelmingly believe 26% did think there was scientific proof of global warming. In another Pew poll conducted last spring, 40% of Americans considered climate change a major national threat, compared with 65% of Latin Americans and slimmer majorities in Europe, Africa, and the Asia-Pacific region. The denial of both the threat of our own responsibilities sounds eerily familiar to those who studied 19th century attitudes towards wildlife. Certainly, if you read some of the writings of the time, says Blockstein, there were very few people who put stock in the idea that humanity could have any impact on the passenger pigeons. Audubon himself dismissed those who believed that such dreadful havoc as hunting would soon put an end to the species. Today, attitudes towards climate change sound similar, continues Blockstein. It's the same kind of argument. The world is so big and the atmosphere is so big, how could we possibly have an impact on the global climate? How do you kill millions of birds? Even the political rhetoric of those who don't want to address climate change aggressively has 19th century echoes. The industry that paid people to kill these birds said, if you restrict the killing, people will lose their jobs. The very same things you hear today. Project Passenger Pigeon might not change the minds of hardcore climate skeptics, but for the rest of us, though, it could serve as a call to take responsibility for how our personal and collective actions affect wildlife and climate. Maybe a close look at the history of human folly will keep us from repeating it. That was pretty much it, though. In a nutshell, kind of just like the history of essentially why we don't have flocks of millions of birds flying around the sky anymore. Um, and it's like I said, it's really a sad story. It was basically technology that defeated the passenger pigeon, and just the lack of interest. Like it's that primal argument. People have making a living killing these birds. If we stop them from killing the birds, they can't make a living. Those people are going to go hungry. We're not going to run out of birds anytime soon. Then what happens? You run out of birds, and the industry dies anyway. Um, so like in all honesty, though, like it sucks because it's something that could have been prevented. But on the good side of it is like this actually has set a huge precedent for us for conservation, even up to this modern day. Like this is an example. This is what can happen if you do this. This is what can happen if you overfish this area. This is what can happen if you just go open season on deer. This is what can happen if you allow a commercial hunting industry to go on. So yeah, I mean, so in one aspect it really sucks and it's really sad, but then in other aspects it has actually brought about a lot of good based off of this example, which is part of the reason why I don't really think we should bring them back. I think this needs to be a failure. If we fix it, the birds are just going to get put in zoos for a long time. And then what are we going to be able to say? Hey, here's a genetically modified band-tailed pigeon that is now classified as a passenger pigeon, but it didn't descend from the flocks. It didn't like it has no instinct from like hundreds of thousands of years on how those flocks migrated. So you'd have to teach them that. And I think I read somewhere their idea of teaching them is using like homing pigeons. So the basically, they grow up with these pigeons will flock and they just follow the pigeons and eventually just establish a migratory pattern for them. But even then, like what happens to the birds if that's not possible? Now you've just got thousands of them living in zoos. And so it's like it's it's just hard to imagine. Like, I bringing them back, I'm not gonna say is a bad idea, because we were responsible for killing them. But on the flip side of it is like what'll happen if, when we do get those millions of flocks, and as soon as they fly over a city, everybody's car's paint job gets ruined. They fly over a field, and now thousands of crop damage is done, and all the farmers are going to want to do is kill them. They're not going to care. I promise you that. They're not going to think that bird is important enough, especially one that we brought back and reintroduced. And yeah, so there's just a lot of controversy around it. But I think the story of the passenger pigeon itself is an important one, and I hope you guys believe me too after sitting this through here this long. And like I said, just take this as a warning. Not everything lasts forever, and that's something that we as humans, I think, need to like remember a lot, especially when it comes to wildlife and nature, our natural resources. There, we could overuse them, and then they're gone. And there's nothing we can do about it. Once you shoot that last bird, once that last animal dies in a zoo, when you cut down that last tree. So that's my spiel on it, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'm sorry I've talked for a while. So, hey, if you guys don't mind, real quick, if you made it this far, you might as well go ahead and once again hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, drop comments down below with what you guys thought, and follow me on my social medias, which we're going to come after this. And until then, next time, guys, I will see you in the next video.